Hello, I'm Christopher Bryde, and I will be discussing the film A Man for All Seasons, 1966, and the ethics regarding it. A little story to start. A while back, I took the train to Canterbury, England. My purpose was to see Canterbury Cathedral. It was established in 597 AD and rebuilt between 1070 and 1077. The cathedral is the place of martyrdom of my confirmation saint, St. Thomas Becket. He was murdered in 1170 AD. Whilst in Canterbury, I happened upon a humble church called St. Dunstan's, and found that it is the final resting place of St. Thomas More, or at least his head, which his daughter Margaret took from a pike on London Bridge and buried here. St. Thomas More was executed by beheading in 1532. There are some interesting connections between Thomas More and Thomas Becket. More was actually named after Becket. Both of them were friends of a king of England, Becket Henry II, and More Henry VIII. Both of them were made Lord Chancellor by their king, and both were executed by order of their king because of their loyalty to the church. And both had plays written about their lives, which were eventually made into films. Thomas Becket's is called Becket 1966, and it's worth a watch. Now, rather than just give analysis and my personal opinion of A Man for All Seasons, I'd like to start by comparing and contrasting Thomas More's portrayal in the film versus two other more contemporary productions. I'd like to identify which of these productions portrays him most genuinely and most ethically. Robert Bolt wrote A Man for All Seasons. He was not Christian and was even a member of the Communist Party. It seems his motives in writing it came from a personal interest in the life and history of Thomas More. Throughout the film, More is shown as a man of conviction to his principles, a man of loyalty, and of honor. Michael Hirst wrote The Tudors. I can find no record of him being Christian or anti-Catholic. It seems his interests are more about the history and art rather than anything personal. His More is maybe more entertaining than Bolt's, but certainly less noble. Hilary Mantel wrote Wolf Hall, and while she was raised Catholic, she became anti-Catholic as an adult. Wolf Hall is a very clear anti-Catholic stance. Her More is very diminutive and shown in a consistently negative light. Now let's look at some shots from these productions and see how they compare. Paul Scofield played Sir Thomas More in both the play and film adaptation. In this shot from the film, More has just been made Lord Chancellor of England. He looks very regal and clean. Jeremy Northam played More in The Tudors. In this scene, More is speaking to Cardinal Wolsey. More is soon to be made Lord Chancellor, and Wolsey will lose power. The Tudors, More is very intellectual, of authority, and is clean. Now look at the More of Wolf Hall, played by Anton Lesser. There, More is still Lord Chancellor in this scene and is actually threatening Thomas Cromwell. He's wearing manky furs, a hat that is too large for him, and it seems there is dried food on his shirt. He doesn't look or sound like a noble man of authority. Back to the film. Here we see More with Henry VIII, played by Robert Shaw. The scene shows a strong friendship between More and the king very clearly, which is historically correct. Over to the Tudors, Henry is played by Jonathan Rhys-Meyers. The scene and others in the series do a pretty decent job of showing their friendship. Now, Wolf Hall. The historical relationship between More and the king is thrown out entirely, and instead, this strange and awkward sort of kinship between More and Cromwell is invented, always making the latter out to be smarter, nobler, and cleaner. And Cromwell is also played by the legendary British actor Mark Rylance. Moving on to Heretics. The Moor of the Tudors is present at the execution of Simon Fish. This is not historically accurate, but was likely added for entertainment value rather than to slant Moor's character. To be fair, it is a fairly entertaining scene. Wolf Hall opens episode 3 showing their Moor attending a brutal torture. They make him look extra strange with these odd reading glasses. And this scene is grotesque and clearly used to make Moor look bad rather than to entertain. Now, a common criticism you'll hear about Thomas More is that during his tenure as Lord Chancellor, that he had 6 heretics prosecuted and ultimately they were sentenced to death. And that this seems to make his own execution for following his conscience less valuable. They were condemned for their conscience as well as him. However, this argument only works if we forget or omit the context. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon were crowned by the incumbent Archbishop of Canterbury, and this was approved by the Pope. Also, the Pope had given the king the title Defender of the Faith. Anything contrary to the teachings of the Church at this time would have been seen as both heretical and as an attack against the king's personage. With context, More acted rightly in his function to the king and state, just as the executioner, who would cut off More's head in the end, acted right in his function. The film largely focuses on More's relationships with family and friends, rather than his work as Lord Chancellor. This is foundational to the idea of living the good life and brings value to his choice in the end. Last comparisons. In the film, More is very dignified at his execution. He states that he is loyal to the king, but God first. He forgives his executioner, prays, and then submits to the axe. To be fair to the Tudors, their More has a very dignified death, much like that of the film, though the scene is rather theatricalized and includes emotional reactions from the king. How Wolf Hall does More's execution is just absolute rubbish. He doesn't make his famous speech or forgive his executioner, and only pathetically mutters a quiet prayer, kneels, and looks at Cromwell. This is just not historically accurate and is clearly there to make him out looking like the baddie getting his just desserts. Now, having looked at the evidence, which production did it best? Most genuinely, most ethically? Well, I think clearly the film did it best overall. The film does have some historical inaccuracies, but there are many more in the other 2 productions, and the writer just doesn't seem to have any motive other than to tell a genuine story. The Tudors has a very entertaining Thomas More, but it's very historically inaccurate and uses scenes like him attending the burning of a heretic purely for entertainment value. To quote Plato's Republic, what he will represent will be anything that appeals to the taste of the ignorant multitude. I really think it's unethical to misrepresent a historical figure, especially a venerated one, purely for the sake of entertainment. Regarding Wolf Hall, it is at least as historically inaccurate as the Tudors, if not more. Given the writer's bias against Catholics and the portrayal of Thomas More, it's just a clear example of unethical writing. And frankly, Wolf Hall is a good example of how Catholics are one of the few groups in modern society that everyone's fine with slandering and disparaging. Now that we've gone through all the juicy bits, let's look at why A Man for All Seasons is just such a great film on its own. I mean, there's the acting, there's the cast, the set, the costume. It's one of the best portrayals of Tudor England ever done. And then there's the ethics. The film does an excellent job of showing the difference between men of virtue and men of vice. In one of his first ever on-screen roles, John Hurt plays Richard Rich, a man of vice. More offers Rich a silver cup, which was given to him as a bribe. More does not want it and has already attempted to throw it into the River Thames. He uses it to test Rich's moral resolve. Rich takes it from him and says that he will use it to buy new clothing. This shows Rich's lack of virtue in contrast to More's virtue. Here, Thomas Cromwell, played by Leo McKern, is convincing Rich to help him bring down More. Cromwell is very ambitious and will do anything to gain power. Rich is ambitious too, but still has some semblance of a conscience, and he feels guilty even considering it. But in the end, he gives in to vice and becomes Cromwell's dog. And here, Rich has just lied to the court about More, giving the evidence needed to condemn him to death. More asks to see Rich's new medallion and what the red dragon on it means. Cromwell replies saying that Rich has just been appointed Attorney General for Wales. More replies, "Why, Richard, it profits a man nothing to give his soul for the whole world, but for Wales." This contrasts More with Rich, More willing to give up the highest position in political life, as well as his own life for the sake of his conscience, and Rich selling his conscience for a very minor position. More was a man of ambition, to be sure, but he's justified in it when he gives it all up. The gold chain of Lord Chancellor, his family, his life, for his conscience. Aristotle would see Thomas More as a virtuous man in a state of eudaimonia, living the good life, and Confucius would call him a Junzi. And he gave all of that up rather than lie and deny his conscience. If we do not have good role models in life, we will struggle to find our way. Without people like More, we are left with only people like Rich, Cromwell, and dare I say, Henry VIII, to look at as examples of how to live our lives. This is part of the reason for having saints in the first place. People who, though imperfect, left us good models of how best to live our lives. A Man for All Seasons is certainly the best portrayal of St. Thomas More, and I would say the best portrayal of a Catholic saint ever done on film. In an age when young people really struggle to find good role models and examples of how best to live their lives, live ethically, live well, they should really look at people like Thomas More rather than false models like, say, Andrew Tate. And our society could really do with more films like this instead of the typical rubbish that Hollywood keeps giving us. And that's about all I have to say.